On October 14, 2023, at 10:22 in the morning, Grant Sullivan was 782 feet below the surface of the Atlantic Ocean, 89 miles west of Key West, Florida, when his camera captured something that should not exist. Grant was 39 years old, a documentary filmmaker who had spent 17 years recording marine life for National Geographic, a father of 8-year-old twin girls, and a man who had dedicated his entire adult life to understanding the ocean after nearly drowning in it at age 12. He held 3 Emmy Awards for underwater cinematography, specialized in filming apex predators like great whites and humpback whales, and carried technical trimix certification, allowing him to dive safely to 1,000 feet. He was not the kind of person who imagined things in the deep, and he was not diving beyond his capabilities that morning. The creature that appeared on his red 8K camera display matched descriptions found in the Book of Job, chapter 41, and the Book of Revelation, chapter 13. 7 distinct heads on a single massive body, each approximately 8 to 10 feet in length, arranged in a symmetrical pattern that resembled nothing in modern marine biology. Scales that reflected his camera lights in a metallic pattern. Not the dull sheen of fish scales, but something closer to polished steel or titanium. Eyes that glowed red-orange in the darkness, not with the brief flash of reflected light like a shark or deep-sea fish, but with a steady, pulsing luminescence that seemed to generate its own power source. The creature was between 60 and 70 feet from head to tail, longer than a school bus, moving through the water in a way that violated every principle of marine locomotion Grant had learned in nearly 2 decades of filming ocean life. But here was the detail that made his hands shake inside his dive gloves, the impossibility that his rational mind could not reconcile with what his camera was recording. At 782 feet below the surface, in water so cold it registered 44 degrees Fahrenheit on his dive computer, in an environment where bioluminescent creatures produced only faint, ghostly glows to attract prey or confuse predators. This thing emitted light with an intensity that made his camera's automatic exposure settings compensate downward. The geometric pattern of that light, rows of what appeared to be symbols or markings along its body that pulsed in sequence like LEDs on a circuit board, was not something evolution had produced in any ocean on Earth. Grant had filmed bioluminescent jellyfish in the Mariana Trench, documented glowing squid off the coast of Japan, spent weeks recording the light displays of deep-sea anglerfish. This was different. This was technology masquerading as biology, or biology that had been engineered beyond anything human science had achieved. Grant Sullivan had not planned to become the man who filmed the Leviathan. He had planned to spend that Tuesday morning documenting a rare coral formation for a series called Abyssal Kingdoms, a 6-part documentary about ecosystems beyond the reach of sunlight. His team consisted of 4 people aboard the research vessel Perseus, a converted fishing boat retrofitted with enough scientific equipment to rival a small university marine lab. His dive partner Bryce, a former Navy submariner with close-cropped gray hair and the calm demeanor of someone who had seen classified things beneath the ocean and learned to keep his mouth shut, was positioned 100 feet above him with a remotely operated vehicle, monitoring Grant's vitals through wireless telemetry and providing backup with a secondary camera system. Dr. Maya Pierce, their marine biologist, was on deck analyzing water samples and coordinating with Captain Owen Clark, who had been navigating these waters for 30 years and knew every ridge and trench of the continental shelf. They were diving at a location where the seafloor dropped from 200 feet to 1,200 feet in less than half a mile, a dramatic underwater cliff face that created unique conditions for deep-dwelling species to venture into shallower territory. Grant was alone in the water by design, using a closed-circuit rebreather that recycled his breathing gas and left no bubbles to disturb the wildlife he was filming. His camera rig weighed 40 pounds on the surface, but was neutrally buoyant at depth, allowing him to move it smoothly without the fatigue that would normally set in after an hour of shooting. He had been filming a cluster of black coral, a species that grew 1 centimeter every 40 years and formed structures that looked like twisted iron sculptures, when the sonar unit mounted on his wrist began showing a massive return signal approaching from below. Grant's first instinct was whale, possibly a humpback that had wandered off its migration route, but the sonar return was wrong. Whales produced a smooth, organic shape on the display. This signal came back angular, segmented, like multiple objects moving in perfect coordination. He adjusted his position, angling the camera downward toward the darkness below, and increased the intensity of his primary lights. The water at this depth absorbed red wavelengths first, turning everything into shades of blue and green. But his professional-grade LED array could punch through the gloom for about 50 feet in good visibility. He had maybe 40 feet of visibility that morning. Decent for the Atlantic, but not exceptional, which meant he would see the creature only seconds before it reached him. It emerged from below like something rising from a nightmare that had learned to swim. The 7 heads came first, arranged in a crown formation around a thick central body. Each head the size of a large dog, each set of eyes tracking independently until they all focused forward in unison. Grant's training took over before his conscious mind could process what he was seeing. He stabilized his breathing, slowed his heart rate through force of will, kept the camera steady and rolling. 4 minutes and 17 seconds of continuous footage, the most important recording of his career, captured in high-definition clarity, while his rational mind screamed that this could not be real. The creature did not swim in the traditional sense, did not undulate its body like an eel or propel itself with fins or flippers. It moved through the water as if the water itself was irrelevant, as if something else was pulling or pushing it forward with invisible force. The sound hit him next, not through his ears but through his chest, a vibration so low frequency it bypassed his hearing entirely and resonated in his sternum and ribs. At 782 feet below the surface, sound should have been dampened by the crushing pressure, reduced to muffled thumps and distant echoes. This sound grew louder as the creature approached, defying the physics of underwater acoustics, pulsing in rhythm with the lights along its body. Grant had recorded whale songs that made his chest vibrate, had felt the sonar clicks of hunting dolphins pass through his body like gentle electric shocks. But this was different in a way he could not articulate. This felt artificial, engineered, like standing too close to a massive subwoofer at a concert, like the creature was not producing sound, but weaponizing it. The creature began circling him at a fixed distance of 12 feet, measured precisely by the laser rangefinder built into his camera rig. 12 feet on the first pass, 12 feet on the second pass, 12 feet on every subsequent pass for the next 90 seconds. No marine animal maintained that kind of geometric precision. Sharks circled prey in tightening spirals, gradually closing distance to assess threat and vulnerability. Whales swam in loose, meandering paths, dictated by curiosity and water currents. This thing traced a perfect circle around him as if following an invisible track, as if something in its brain or nervous system or whatever passed for cognition in that massive body understood mathematics and chose to demonstrate it. Grant remained motionless, letting the creature complete 6 full rotations, his dive computer counting his elevated heart rate, 55 beats per minute climbing to 70, then 80, then 95, his body's autonomic response overriding his conscious attempts at calm. His dive computer registered something else during the third rotation, something that should have been impossible according to every principle of thermodynamics he had learned in his physics classes and forgotten in his 20s. The water temperature dropped from 44 degrees Fahrenheit to 38 degrees in less than 15 seconds, cold enough that he felt it through his 7mm neoprene wetsuit, through his thermal underlayer, through the warm bubble of water his body heat had created in the first hour of the dive. Then the temperature spiked back to 44 degrees just as quickly. Water at this depth did not change temperature that rapidly. The ocean was a thermal mass, resistant to quick shifts, buffered by pressure and volume. A 6-degree drop and recovery in 30 seconds required either a massive injection of cold water from a deeper current, which would have shown up on his pressure gauges as turbulence, or a localized cooling effect that violated the second law of thermodynamics. The 7 heads stopped moving independently and turned toward him in unison, all 14 eyes fixed on his camera lens, and Grant understood with absolute certainty that the creature was aware of him not as prey or threat, but as observer. The eyes did not blink, did not track or waver, simply stared with an intensity that felt like being examined under a microscope. He kept filming, kept his breathing regular through his rebreather's mouthpiece, and noted the exact timestamp on his camera's internal recorder. 10:37 and 42 seconds in the morning, October 14th, 2023, the moment when something biblical and something technological stared at him through 782 feet of Atlantic seawater and decided he was worth studying. 100 feet above him, Bryce was watching telemetry data on his laptop and seeing numbers that did not make sense. Grant's heart rate had jumped from 55 beats per minute to 110 in less than 3 minutes, the kind of spike that indicated panic or physical exertion. But his breathing rate remained steady at 12 breaths per minute, controlled and professional. His core body temperature had dropped half a degree, unexplained but not immediately dangerous. The acoustic sensors Bryce had deployed to record ambient ocean noise were picking up low-frequency vibrations that registered off the bottom of the scale, below 20 Hz, at the edge of human perception, but powerful enough to show up as solid bars on his audio software. Bryce opened a channel to Grant's communication system, his voice crackling slightly through the underwater digital link. "Grant, your heart rate just doubled in 2 minutes. Status check." "You need me to descend?" Grant pressed the transmit button on his wrist unit once, the signal for acknowledged but unable to talk, then keyed his microphone and spoke quietly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "I'm filming something. Maintain ROV position. Don't descend. Don't turn on any additional lights. Just stay where you are and keep monitoring." Bryce had worked with Grant long enough to recognize the tone of someone who had found something significant and did not want it disturbed. He checked the ROV's sonar display and felt his own heart rate increase. The return signal showed an object 70 feet long positioned exactly 12 feet from Grant's location, circling him in a pattern that looked computer-generated in its precision. But the density reading made no sense. The sonar was registering metallic density, closer to steel or titanium than to organic tissue. Yet Grant's camera feed, which Bryce could see on a secondary monitor, showed something alive, something with skin and scales and eyes that moved. After 4 minutes and 17 seconds of circling, the creature stopped. All 7 heads turned downward in perfect synchronization, orienting toward the darkness below, toward depths where even Grant's technical certification would not allow him to follow. Then it descended, not swimming but gliding, dropping vertically through the water column like an elevator on an invisible cable. maintaining its rigid posture until the glow from its body faded into the deep blue-black nothing beyond his lights. Grant remained motionless for another 30 seconds, his camera still recording empty water, his heart rate gradually returning to something approaching normal. He marked the GPS coordinates on his dive computer, filmed the coral formations nearest to where the creature had appeared, so he could identify this exact spot again if needed, then checked his gas supply and decompression obligations. He had been at 782 feet for 18 minutes total, which meant he was now facing 3 hours and 40 minutes of mandatory decompression stops on his ascent, staged intervals at decreasing depths that would allow the nitrogen dissolved in his blood and tissues to off-gas slowly enough to avoid the bends. He began his ascent at 30 feet per minute, the maximum safe rate for technical diving, ascending through the water column in controlled stages while his mind raced through what he had just witnessed, and his professional training forced him to maintain the discipline that kept technical divers alive. At 70 feet, his first decompression stop, he hung motionless in the water and tried to process the implications of the footage stored on his camera's solid-state drives. Bryce descended the ROV to 782 feet immediately after Grant began his ascent, positioning the remotely operated vehicle at the exact coordinates where the creature had been circling, scanning with sonar and high-definition cameras in all directions. The water was empty. The sonar showed nothing larger than a few scattered fish. Whatever that thing was, it had vanished completely in the 3 minutes it took Bryce to get the ROV into position. Grant surfaced at 2:07 in the afternoon, 3 hours and 45 minutes after beginning his dive. His body tired from the physical stress of deep diving, but his mind sharp with adrenaline. Captain Owen Clark helped him onto the dive platform at the stern of the Perseus, steadying him while he removed his fins and unclipped his rebreather, and Grant could see in Owen's weathered face that Bryce had already told the crew what the ROV sonar had detected. Dr. Maya Pierce, the team's marine biologist, was waiting with a laptop already queued to the section of video Bryce had pulled from the ROV's secondary camera feed, the wide shot that showed Grant hovering motionless while something massive and inexplicable circled him like a predator sizing up prey. Maya had spent 6 years earning her doctorate studying deep-sea fauna, had published papers on species discovered in the Mariana Trench and the Puerto Rico Trench, and Grant watched her face go pale as she scrubbed through the footage frame by frame, trying to match what she was seeing against her encyclopedic knowledge of marine taxonomy. Bryce, standing beside the laptop with his arms crossed and his jaw tight in the way it got when something bothered him, finally spoke the thought everyone on the deck was avoiding. "Grant, I spent 12 years on submarines. I've seen giant squid. I've seen oarfish that were 30 feet long. I've seen things in the deep that aren't in any textbook. That thing down there, the way it moved, that's not natural. That's not biological locomotion. Look at the way it holds position, the way it descends. There's no propulsion mechanism, no fins, no water displacement. It's moving through the ocean like the ocean isn't even there." Captain Owen Clark had already done what protocol required for any significant marine discovery and radioed the Coast Guard to report an unidentified species sighting, providing their coordinates and a brief description of what Grant had filmed. The response from the Coast Guard station in Key West came back within 2 minutes, far faster than normal communications turnaround, and the message was specific in a way that made Owen's instincts flare with suspicion. "Stay at current position. Do not transmit any video or photographic evidence via radio or satellite. Federal authorities en route to your location. Estimated arrival 47 minutes." Owen had been a charter captain and research vessel commander for 30 years, had ferried scientists and film crews to dive sites all over the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico, and he had never received instructions like that from the Coast Guard. Do not transmit evidence was not standard language for a biological discovery. Federal authorities en route was not how marine biologists usually got involved. And 47 minutes from Key West to their current position, 89 miles west-southwest of the island, was a flight time that assumed a helicopter was already in the air and heading toward them before Owen had even made the call. Maya looked up from the laptop screen, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of scientific excitement and something that looked like fear. I can't identify this. The body structure doesn't match anything in the phylum Chordata, but it has vertebrate characteristics. The head arrangement is radially symmetric, but the body is bilaterally symmetric. That combination doesn't exist in nature. And the way the light patterns pulse, that's not bioluminescence. That's something else, something that requires complex neural control or maybe electrical systems. I don't know. I don't even know what I'm looking at. Grant was stripping out of his wetsuit, hanging his equipment on the racks built into the Perseus's dive platform, when he heard the helicopter. The sound came from the east, from the direction of Key West. A heavy rhythmic thump that meant military or Coast Guard rather than civilian, and it was approaching fast and low. Owen checked his watch, his expression darkening. 47 minutes had been the estimate. The helicopter arrived in 43 minutes, which meant it had been airborne and flying toward their coordinates before Owen had finished his initial radio call. The helicopter circled once, a Coast Guard MH-60 Jayhawk painted in the service's distinctive red and white livery, then hovered over the stern deck and deployed a team of 4 people on a rescue hoist. 3 were wearing standard Coast Guard uniforms. The 4th was in civilian clothes, khaki pants, and a blue windbreaker with a NOAA logo, but Owen recognized the bearing and the way he moved. That was military posture, military efficiency, the kind of body language that came from years of training that did not happen in civilian marine biology programs. The man in the NOAA windbreaker introduced himself as Dr. Blake Warren, marine biologist, but he did not offer credentials or affiliation beyond the logo on his jacket, and he moved directly to the laptop where Maya's footage was still paused on a frame showing all 7 of the creature's heads turned toward Grant's camera. Blake watched the 4 minutes and 17 seconds of video without speaking, without asking questions, his face carefully neutral in a way that suggested he was looking at something he had seen before, or at least something he had been briefed to expect. When the footage ended, when the creature descended into darkness and disappeared, Blake closed the laptop and turned to address the crew with the tone of someone delivering pre-written instructions. This footage is now classified under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, Section 7, Subpart C, which authorizes federal seizure of documentation pertaining to endangered or unidentified species pending scientific review. All recording equipment, all data storage devices, all GPS logs and sonar records will be retained by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration for analysis. National Geographic has been notified of the situation, and your documentary contract has been suspended pending federal review of the material. Grant had been a professional filmmaker long enough to know when someone was following a script, and Blake Warren was reciting legal language that sounded official but felt wrong in its specificity and speed. That footage belongs to me under my contract with National Geographic. You can request copies through proper channels, but you can't just confiscate my equipment without a warrant, or at least some kind of court order. I know my rights here. This isn't a military operation. This is a civilian research vessel in international waters. Blake's expression did not change, did not show irritation or sympathy, remained professionally blank, in a way that was almost more unsettling than anger would have been. This vessel is currently within the United States Exclusive Economic Zone, which extends 200 nautical miles from shore, and under Title 16 of the United States Code, federal authorities have jurisdiction over marine resources and scientific discoveries within that zone. You can contest this seizure through administrative appeal, but the equipment stays with us today. That's not negotiable. DT. The Coast Guard personnel began collecting equipment with practiced efficiency, disconnecting Grant's camera from its housing, removing the solid-state drives from the recording system, taking the laptop Maya had been using, even confiscating the cell phones from all 4 crew members with the explanation that they might contain backup copies of the footage or photographs of the creature. They were required to sign non-disclosure agreements on the spot, single-page documents printed on Coast Guard letterhead that threatened federal prosecution for unauthorized discussion of classified marine species documentation. Grant signed, but not before he had already completed a task that years of documentary work in politically sensitive locations had taught him to do instinctively. Before the helicopter had arrived, while he was still stripping out of his wetsuit and his hands were out of sight behind the equipment racks, he had removed the small backup memory card from his camera's secondary recording system. A failsafe he always maintained in case primary systems failed, and hidden it inside the emergency oxygen cylinder mounted on the dive platform, tucked into the regulator housing where no casual search would find it. 43 seconds of the creature's closest approach, the clearest footage of its 7 heads and glowing eyes, preserved on a thumbnail-sized card worth more than everything else the federal team was confiscating. The Coast Guard helicopter departed at 2:54 in the afternoon, 47 minutes after arriving, taking with it every piece of electronic equipment Grant's team had used to document the dive except for basic navigation systems that Owen needed to pilot the Perseus back to port. Within 6 hours, the coordinates where Grant had encountered the creature were declared a temporary marine sanctuary with a 5 nautical mile exclusion zone, officially justified as protection for a sensitive coral ecosystem, but enforced with Coast Guard patrol boats that appeared with suspicious speed. Grant noticed something during those 6 hours of transit back to Key West, something that made the situation even stranger than the creature itself. Blake Warren and his team had asked detailed questions about the dive profile, about the equipment Grant had used, about the duration and depth and gas mixtures. They had confiscated GPS logs and sonar data, but nobody had asked Grant to show them the exact location where the creature had appeared. Nobody had asked him to mark it on a chart or describe the bottom features or estimate distances from identifiable landmarks. They already knew. They had flown directly to those coordinates, arrived before Owen had finished his initial Coast Guard call, brought equipment and legal paperwork specifically designed for this situation. That meant someone had been watching, monitoring their dive operations in real time, waiting for exactly this discovery. Back in Key West that evening, after the Perseus had docked and the crew had dispersed with their signed NDAs and government contact numbers and warnings about federal prosecution for violations, Grant retrieved the memory card from its hiding place in the oxygen cylinder and transferred the 43 seconds of footage to an encrypted cloud storage account he maintained for sensitive documentary work. He uploaded it from a coffee shop 3 blocks from the marina, using public Wi-Fi that could not be traced to him, then deleted the local copy and destroyed the memory card. Maya came to his hotel room an hour later, still visibly shaken by the day's events, and Grant showed her the footage on his laptop, the clearest frames he had captured of the creature's approach. Maya watched in silence, her hands pressed together in front of her mouth, and when the clip ended, she opened her backpack and pulled out a worn, leather-bound Bible, the kind with gilt-edged pages and ribbon bookmarks, the kind that looked like a family heirloom. "Grant, I need to show you something." I grew up in a very religious household. My grandmother was a Baptist minister, and I stopped believing most of it when I got into science. But I never stopped reading the texts because they're part of my family history. When I saw your footage this afternoon, before the Coast Guard arrived, something clicked in my memory, and I couldn't place it until now. Phew. She opened the Bible to Revelation, chapter 13, verse 1, and read aloud in a voice that was steady but quiet, with the weight of implications neither of them wanted to fully acknowledge. "And I saw a beast rising out of the sea, with 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems on its horns and blasphemous names on its heads." Grant leaned forward, studying the creature frozen on his laptop screen, and counted the heads visible in the frame. 7. Maya turned to the Book of Job, chapter 41, the description of Leviathan, and continued reading. "His sneezings flash forth light, and his eyes are like the eyelids of the dawn. Out of his mouth go flaming torches, sparks of fire leap forth. Out of his nostrils comes forth smoke, as from a boiling pot and burning rushes." Grant scrubbed back through the footage, frame by frame, and stopped on a section he had not examined closely before, a moment when the creature was positioned broadside to his camera. There was something in the water around it, a disturbance that he had assumed was sediment stirred up by its movement, but there was no current at that depth strong enough to suspend particles like that. The disturbance seemed to emanate from the creature itself, from the areas Maya's reading identified as nostrils, spreading through the water in patterns that looked less like sediment and more like smoke or vapor or heat distortion. Maya closed the Bible and set it on the table between them, her hands trembling slightly. "Grant, you filmed something that people have been describing for 2,000 years. This isn't a new discovery. This is documentation of something ancient, something that's been in these oceans long enough to become mythology, to get written into religious texts as monsters and beasts and leviathans. The Bible isn't the only source. I've read papers on comparative mythology, and every ancient maritime culture has versions of this. The Babylonians called it Tiamat. The Norse called it Jörmungandr. The Hindu texts describe Makara. The Mayans wrote about Tzipactli. All of them describe multi-headed serpents with glowing eyes, with metallic or jeweled scales, coming from the deep ocean. We've been treating these as myths, as primitive attempts to explain natural phenomena. What if they weren't myths? What if they were eyewitness accounts? Grant Sullivan was not the kind of person who accepted silence as an answer, not after 17 years of investigating stories that powerful people preferred to keep buried, not after building a career on documenting truths that institutions found inconvenient. The non-disclosure agreement he had signed carried the threat of federal prosecution, but it did not eliminate his ability to ask questions or his network of contacts in the scientific and journalistic communities who specialized in extracting classified information through legal channels. 3 days after the encounter, he reached out to Riley Park, an investigative journalist with The Intercept, who had published multiple exposés on government overclassification of environmental data and inappropriate use of national security designations to suppress climate research. Riley had sources inside NOAA, inside the Coast Guard, inside the Navy's oceanographic research divisions, and she had a reputation for protecting whistleblowers and treating sensitive information with the kind of careful documentation that made it difficult for authorities to retaliate. Riley agreed to meet Grant at a diner in Marathon, halfway between Key West and Miami, far enough from both locations to avoid casual surveillance, but public enough to discourage anything more aggressive. She listened to his account of the dive without interrupting, took no notes, asked only clarifying questions about timeline and technical details, and when he finished, she pulled out her phone and showed him a photograph of a woman in her mid-50s with gray-streaked hair and the weathered complexion of someone who had spent decades working outdoors. Her name is Dr. Claire Dawson. She was a senior oceanographer at Scripps Institution of Oceanography in San Diego, one of the most prestigious marine research facilities in the world. Published over 40 papers on deep-sea ecosystems and tectonic activity. 2 years ago, she was terminated, officially for budget restructuring. But she's been trying to tell anyone who will listen that she was fired for reporting something she saw during a research dive off the coast of San Diego in 2021. Something with multiple heads, glowing eyes, and movement patterns that violated known marine biology. She never got footage because her equipment malfunctioned, which she believes was sabotage, but she filed reports and the institution buried them. I've been in contact with her for 8 months, trying to verify her claims, and now you show up with video evidence of exactly what she described. Dr. Claire Dawson lived in a small rental house in Encinitas, California, an hour north of San Diego, and she spoke to Grant via encrypted video call the following day with the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed these details many times and knew that credibility depended on specificity. She had been conducting a survey dive at 940 feet, deeper than Grant's encounter, using a submersible rather than personal diving equipment, when the creature had appeared on her sonar and then briefly in her external lights. 7 heads, each tracking independently before focusing together, body length estimated at 75 feet, metallic appearance, eyes that produced their own light. The encounter had lasted less than 2 minutes before her submersible's electrical systems began experiencing cascading failures, forcing an emergency ascent. When she surfaced and reported the sighting, her institution's response was immediate and aggressive. Her data was confiscated, her submersible was taken offline for inspection and never returned to service, and within 3 months, she was informed that her position was being eliminated due to funding constraints. But Claire had not been idle during the 2 years since her termination. She had filed Freedom of Information Act requests, cultivated relationships with other dismissed researchers, collected documentation that painted a pattern of suppression spanning decades. She sent Grant a folder containing 14 reports of similar sightings dating back to 1987, each from a different location, each followed by institutional intervention and silencing. Costa Rica, in 1987, a commercial salvage diver who lost his certification after reporting a multi-headed creature at 600 feet. Japan, in 1994, a fishing crew whose vessel was confiscated by the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force after sonar recorded an unidentified biological contact. Norway in 2003, a North Sea oil platform that reported seeing something massive and multi-headed during an underwater inspection, followed by a classified investigation. New Zealand in 2008, a research team studying deep-sea volcanic vents whose footage was seized by military authorities. Indonesia in 2015, a dive guide who photographed something he could not identify and was visited by government officials who deleted his images and threatened legal action. San Diego in 2021, Claire's own encounter and termination. And now, Florida in 2023, Grant's footage and the immediate federal response. The geographical pattern was undeniable. Every sighting occurred within 50 miles of a major oceanic trench, locations where the seafloor dropped to depths exceeding 8,000 feet, places where tectonic plates collided, and subduction zones created the deepest and most geologically active regions of the ocean. Riley connected Grant with another member of her network, Dr. Vincent Shaw, a professor of ancient Near Eastern studies at UCLA, who specialized in apocalyptic literature and comparative mythology. Vincent had spent 30 years analyzing texts from Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, India, China, and pre-Columbian America, tracking recurring themes and symbols across cultures that had no known contact with each other. When he watched Grant's footage, his reaction was not skepticism but recognition. He opened a folder on his computer containing high-resolution photographs of cuneiform tablets from Babylon, dated to approximately 2,600 years before the Common Era. Tablets that depicted a multi-headed creature rising from Abzu, the Babylonian term for the abyssal ocean depths. The proportions matched what Grant had filmed. The arrangement of heads matched. The descriptions in the accompanying text mentioned eyes that burned like copper in the furnace, and movement that defied the waters as if walking upon dry land. Vincent pulled up additional sources, Sanskrit texts describing Makara, the Hindu sea creature with multiple heads that guarded the gates to the underworld. Mayan codices showing Chipaktli, the crocodilian monster whose body formed the earth, and whose heads numbered 7 in some versions of the myth. Norse descriptions of Jörmungandr, the world serpent, whose coils encircled the earth, and whose appearance presaged Ragnarok. Every ancient maritime culture has this creature in their mythology, Vincent said, his voice carrying the careful enthusiasm of an academic presenting evidence to skeptical peers. We've been treating these accounts as metaphorical, as primitive attempts to explain natural disasters like tsunamis or earthquakes or volcanic eruptions. We've been assuming that ancient people created these myths to cope with their fear of the unknown ocean. But what if we've had it backwards? What if these aren't myths at all? What if they're historical documentation, eyewitness accounts passed down through generations and eventually codified in religious texts and cultural stories? The descriptions are too consistent across too many cultures, too specific in their details to be coincidental. 7 heads appears again and again. Glowing eyes appears in texts separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. Metallic or jeweled scales, that specific detail shows up in Babylonian, Greek, Hindu, and Aztec sources. And here's the detail that nobody has been able to explain. Almost every ancient text that mentions these creatures associates them with earthquakes, with geological catastrophe, with the earth shaking and the seas rising. The Book of Revelation describes the beast rising from the sea, followed by cosmic disasters. The Babylonian Enuma Elish connects Tiamat to the creation and destruction of the world through tectonic upheaval. The Norse texts say Jörmungandr's movements cause earthquakes. What if that connection isn't mythological symbolism? What if it's observational correlation? Grant felt something cold settle in his chest. The recognition that the pattern Vincent was describing matched something Claire had mentioned during their call, something she had not emphasized but had included in her documentation. He opened Claire's folder and searched for the dates of the 14 reported sightings, then cross-referenced them against USGS earthquake databases for the corresponding regions. Costa Rica, 1987. A magnitude 6.1 earthquake struck 70 miles from the sighting location 68 hours after the report. Japan, 1994. Magnitude 6.8 earthquake, 73 hours later. Norway, 2003. Magnitude 6.2, 71 hours later. New Zealand, 2008. Magnitude 6.5, 69 hours later. Indonesia, 2015. Magnitude 6.3, 72 hours later. San Diego, 2021. Magnitude 6.0, 70 hours later. Every single sighting preceded a significant earthquake within 3 days, within a range of 68 to 73 hours, in the region where the creature had been observed. The correlation was not coincidental. The creatures were appearing before tectonic events, not randomly, not as passive observers, but as predictors or possibly as triggers of seismic activity. Grant verified the pattern 3 more times using different earthquake databases and different methodologies to eliminate the possibility of confirmation bias or selective data interpretation. The correlation held. 71 hours on average between sighting and seismic event, with a standard deviation of only 2.3 hours, a statistical consistency that could not occur by chance. He was preparing to share this discovery with Riley when his phone started receiving calls from blocked numbers, no caller ID, just silence on the other end when he answered. 5 calls in one evening, then 8 calls the next day. On the 3rd day, the calls stopped and someone broke into his hotel room while he was having lunch 3 blocks away. Nothing was stolen. His laptop was still on the desk, his camera equipment still in its cases, his wallet and passport untouched. But his belongings had been searched with professional thoroughness. Drawers opened and carefully closed, luggage repositioned slightly wrong. The kind of intrusion designed to send a message, rather than take anything. Grant moved to a different hotel that afternoon, paid cash, registered under a friend's name, and backed up all his data to multiple encrypted cloud services with passwords that would require quantum computing to crack. The pressure extended beyond Grant within the week. Maya Pierce received notification from her employer, the Atlantic Oceanographic Institute, that she was being reassigned to a research project in Montana, studying freshwater lake ecosystems, a landlocked position that would remove her from any marine biology work and from any proximity to the Atlantic Ocean where the encounter had occurred. The reassignment came with a substantial salary increase and a promotion to senior researcher, incentives that would make refusal look unreasonable and suspicious. Maya declined the position and submitted her resignation instead, a decision that cost her career trajectory, but preserved her integrity and her ability to continue investigating what she had witnessed. Bryce received a visit at his home in Key West from 2 men in civilian clothes who identified themselves as contractors working with the Office of Naval Intelligence, offering him a consulting position on an unnamed project with an annual salary of $200,000 in exchange for his technical expertise in submersible operations and his agreement to a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement that covered not just the creature encounter, but all aspects of his professional experience. In the Navy, Bryce, who had been earning $45,000 a year as a freelance dive coordinator, recognized the offer for what it was and declined, then found that his dive certifications were suddenly under review by licensing authorities who had never questioned his credentials in 20 years. Captain Owen Clark faced the most immediate and devastating consequences. His vessel operator's license was suspended pending investigation into alleged safety violations during the October 14th research mission, violations that were not specified in the suspension notice and that Owen knew had not occurred because he had maintained flawless operational records for 3 decades without a single incident. The Perseus was impounded at the Key West Marina, prevented from leaving port, and Owen's business effectively ceased to exist overnight. He tried to fight the suspension through administrative appeals and discovered that the investigating authority was not the Coast Guard or the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission, but a federal office he had never heard of, the Marine Resources Security Division, which operated under classified protocols that prevented him from accessing the evidence against him or cross-examining his accusers. Grant watched his crew being systematically isolated and neutralized, their careers and livelihoods destroyed or compromised, and understood that the response was designed to prevent collaboration and silence through intimidation and economic pressure. Riley Park worked her sources inside the federal bureaucracy with the caution of someone who understood that pushing too hard could result in the same treatment Grant's crew was experiencing. And after 2 weeks, she obtained a document that changed the entire context of the investigation. It was a single page, leaked by someone inside the Navy's Oceanographic Research Division, poorly scanned and partially redacted. But the visible text was enough. The header read, Deep Sea Archaeology Project, Operational Summary, Fiscal Year 1994, and the content discussed something called sentinels, in the plural form, not as a single anomaly, but as multiple entities distributed across strategic locations. The document described sentinels as biological monitoring systems deployed at major tectonic subduction zones for early warning of seismic events, and noted that activation patterns correspond to earthquake activity with 94% predictive accuracy 72 hours in advance. The language was clinical, bureaucratic, the tone of people discussing established technology rather than unexplained phenomena, and the implications were staggering. These creatures were not random, not natural, not the product of evolution or undiscovered marine biology. They were systems, deployed, engineered for a specific purpose, positioned deliberately at locations where tectonic plates collided and earthquakes originated. Vincent Shaw obtained a second leaked document through his academic network, a colleague at MIT who had connections to Defense Department research archives, and this document provided details that were even more disturbing in their specificity. It was an analysis report dated 1994, classified secret with multiple redactions, discussing tissue sample recovered from Sentinel-7, Sea of Japan, during an unspecified operation. The biological analysis described DNA structures that did not match any known taxonomic classification, cellular architecture that incorporated both organic and synthetic components, and metabolic processes that violated standard biochemistry. The conclusion section, partially visible despite heavy redaction, stated that biotechnology demonstrates capabilities beyond current human scientific achievement by estimated minimum 500 years, possibly indicating Type II civilization on Kardashev scale or advanced precursor culture predating known human history. The document did not speculate on origin, did not offer theories about who or what had created these creatures, but it made clear that they were not natural and that their technology was not human, at least not human technology from any known contemporary source. Grant sat in his hotel room reading these documents on Riley's encrypted laptop and felt the familiar sensation of a story expanding beyond his initial understanding, the moment when a simple mystery revealed itself to be part of something vastly larger and more complex. The creature he had filmed was not an animal. It was a machine, or perhaps something between machine and organism, biosynthetic, engineered, placed in the ocean deliberately to monitor tectonic activity and provide advance warning of earthquakes. But placed by whom? The documents dated to 1994, nearly 30 years ago, which meant the U.S. government had known about these entities for at least 3 decades and had classified that knowledge at the highest levels. The biblical descriptions and ancient mythology suggested the sentinels had been in the oceans for thousands of years, long enough to be observed by multiple pre-industrial civilizations, long enough to become incorporated into religious texts and cultural stories as monsters and leviathans and sea serpents. That timeline eliminated any possibility of modern human deployment. Whatever civilization or intelligence had created these monitoring systems had done so in the distant past, perhaps 2,000 years ago, perhaps far longer, and had either disappeared or chosen to remain hidden while their creations continued to function. The question that kept Grant awake at night, the question that made him check his hotel room locks and vary his daily routes, and maintain constant awareness of who might be following him was not about the creatures themselves, but about the people who had suppressed information about them. The U.S. government knew. The Navy knew. NOAA knew. Multiple governments across multiple decades had coordinated to hide evidence, silence witnesses, confiscate documentation. They were protecting something, and the level of coordination suggested that what they were protecting was not just the existence of the Sentinels, but something deeper, something about their origin or purpose that justified destroying careers and threatening prosecution and maintaining classified programs for decades. Grant had filmed one of these entities and survived the encounter, but 14 other people over 36 years had reported similar sightings, and every single one had been silenced or discredited or removed from positions where they could continue investigating. He was still free, still able to work with Riley and Claire and Vincent, but he knew that freedom was conditional and temporary, dependent on his continued caution and his ability to stay ahead of people who had far more resources and far fewer legal constraints than he did. Vincent Shaw continued excavating classified documents through Freedom of Information Act requests and academic back channels, and 3 months after Grant's encounter, he obtained a third file that provided the final piece of context that transformed speculation into documented fact. The document was a declassified biological analysis from 1994, released to public archives in 2019 after a mandatory 25-year classification period expired. Though it had been filed in a section of the National Archives that researchers rarely accessed and had never been digitized or indexed properly. The analysis detailed microscopic examination of tissue samples recovered from what the document called Sentinel-7 during a covert retrieval operation in the Sea of Japan. The cellular structure showed features that made no sense according to conventional biology. DNA was present, but organized in patterns that did not match the double helix structure found in all terrestrial life, arranged instead in a triple helix configuration with base pairs that included synthetic molecules not found in nature. Carbon dating had been attempted and produced inconclusive results because the isotope decay rates did not follow expected patterns, suggesting either contamination or the presence of materials that had been shielded from normal radioactive decay through unknown processes. The most disturbing finding appeared in a section discussing the interface between organic and synthetic components within individual cells. The tissue contained structures that resembled both mitochondria, the energy-producing organelles found in biological cells, and microcircuitry, with conductive pathways made from materials that analysis identified as metallic compounds arranged in geometric patterns too precise to be natural. The report's conclusion, written in the careful language of scientists presenting findings they knew would be challenged, stated that the specimen represents biotechnology beyond current human capability, suggesting either advanced terrestrial civilization predating known historical record or non-terrestrial origin with estimated technological development exceeding human achievement by minimum 1,000 years. Fifth, the final paragraph, added as a note by whoever had cleared the document for declassification, referenced biblical descriptions of Leviathan and the beast from Revelation, suggesting that historical sightings documented in religious texts may represent consistent observation of same or similar entities over a period of 2,000 to 3,000 years, indicating deployment and continuous operation over archaeological timescales. Grant shared this document with Claire Dawson, who had been monitoring seismic activity in the region where Grant had encountered the Sentinel, and she provided information that confirmed the creatures were still active, and the government was still tracking them. Since October 14th, NOAA had installed 7 oceanographic monitoring stations in a ring around the exclusion zone west of Key West, officially designated as marine ecosystem research platforms, but equipped with sonar arrays far more powerful than anything needed for biological surveys. The stations were transmitting data continuously to a Navy facility in Norfolk, Virginia, and Claire had managed to intercept fragments of that data through a contact at a civilian research institution that shared bandwidth on the same underwater cable network. The sonar signatures showed the Sentinel was still present, still moving in the area, still exhibiting the same precise geometric patterns in its behavior. More significantly, Claire had obtained leaked information suggesting that the Navy was tracking 11 different Sentinels globally, each positioned near major subduction zones, each monitored continuously through classified sensor networks. The 14 historical sightings that Claire had documented were just a fraction of total encounters, representing only the cases where civilian witnesses had managed to report their observations before being silenced. The pattern of Sentinel activations, the frequency with which they appeared and became observable to surface vessels or divers, had increased dramatically in recent years. Claire's analysis of leaked Navy data showed an average of 2 Sentinel sightings per year from 1987 through 2018, a relatively stable baseline that suggested the creatures remained deep and hidden most of the time. But from 2019 through 2023, the frequency had jumped to an average of 8 sightings per year, a 340% increase that correlated with a documented increase in global seismic activity. The Earth's tectonic systems were becoming more unstable, more active, generating more frequent and more powerful earthquakes, and the Sentinels were responding to that instability by surfacing more often, by activating their warning systems more frequently, by making themselves visible in ways they had not done for decades. Whatever they had been designed to monitor was accelerating, and their increased presence suggested that whoever or whatever had deployed them had understood that humanity would eventually need more frequent warnings. Riley Park worked with Grant to prepare a carefully worded article for The Intercept that focused on government suppression of scientific discovery rather than on the more sensational aspects of biblical creatures and ancient technology, framing the story in terms that would be taken seriously by mainstream readers and that would minimize the risk of the piece being dismissed as conspiracy theory or pseudoscience. The article titled Unidentified Marine Phenomenon Captured on Film, Federal Suppression Raises Questions About Scientific Transparency was published in January 2024, 3 months after Grant's encounter, and included heavily pixelated frames from his footage that showed the creature's silhouette without revealing enough detail to allow precise identification. The piece documented the confiscation of equipment, the suspension of National Geographic's contract, the career destruction experienced by Maya, Bryce, and Owen, and the pattern of similar suppressions over 3 decades. It did not mention Revelation or Leviathan, did not speculate about non-human technology, stuck carefully to demonstrable facts about government overreach and the classification of environmental data that should have been public. The article generated 4 million views in 48 hours, sparked congressional inquiries about NOAA's classification protocols, and led to Grant receiving both widespread support from scientific transparency advocates and death threats from people who accused him of either fabricating the encounter or endangering national security by revealing classified information. Independent video analysts examined the pixelated footage Grant had released and confirmed that it showed no evidence of computer-generated imagery, no signs of manipulation or hoaxing, represented genuine video recorded underwater at the depth and location specified. Marine biologists who viewed the images could not identify the creature, could not match it to any known species, acknowledged that its morphology violated standard taxonomic classifications. The attention brought pressure on NOAA and the Navy to respond, and their response was to maintain absolute silence, to refuse all interview requests, to issue no statements beyond a brief press release indicating that the October 14th sighting remains under investigation and involves sensitive environmental data protected under federal marine conservation statutes. That silence, that refusal to engage even with basic questions about why scientific data was being classified, generated more suspicion and more public interest than any explanation might have produced. Grant's encrypted email began receiving messages from other witnesses, people who had seen similar creatures or who had worked in government positions with access to information about undersea monitoring programs, people who were willing to talk anonymously but who would not go public because they had seen what happened to those who did. Grant Sullivan continues to work today with a loose coalition of dismissed scientists, investigative journalists, and former government employees who believe the public has a right to know about the Sentinels and their purpose. But progress is slow, and the opposition is entrenched and well-funded. The exclusion zone west of Key West remains in effect, officially justified as protection for endangered coral reefs, patrolled by Coast Guard vessels that turn away any civilian boats that approach within 5 nautical miles of the coordinates where Grant encountered the creature. NOAA has offered no timeline for when the zone might be reopened, has provided no scientific data to justify the Coral Reef designation, has stonewalled every Freedom of Information Act request with claims of ongoing investigation and national security exemptions. In March 2024, seismographs recorded a magnitude 6.3 earthquake in Cuba, approximately 130 miles from the encounter site, exactly 71 hours after Grant's dive. Claire Dawson verified the timeline, confirmed the correlation, added it to her database of Sentinel appearances and subsequent seismic events. The pattern continues to hold. The creatures know. But there is one detail that nobody noticed in the first analysis of Grant's footage, one frame that Maya Pierce discovered 4 months after the encounter while preparing an academic paper on government suppression of marine biology research. In the final 3 seconds before the creature descended into the deep, before it vanished from Grant's lights and camera, there is a reflection visible in the darkness below it. A metallic gleam that does not match the random scatter of light off rock or sediment. Maya enhanced that section of the video using forensic imaging software, increased contrast and sharpened edges, and what emerged was unmistakable. A structure, geometric, massive, extending beyond the limits of what the camera could resolve. Straight edges where natural geology produces curves and fractures. Right angles where erosion and tectonic forces create chaos. The Sentinel was not swimming randomly in the deep. It was stationed there, positioned above something, guarding something or monitoring something that lay on the seafloor 782 feet below the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. The creature that Grant filmed, the entity that matches descriptions from the Book of Revelation and the Book of Job, and tablets from Babylon, and texts from cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, is not the mystery. It is the guardian. And the question that no government agency will answer, the question that keeps Grant awake despite the threats and the career destruction, and the knowledge that pursuing this story may cost him everything, is simple and terrifying. If these creatures were deployed thousands of years ago as monitoring systems, as warnings of tectonic disaster, as sentinels watching over geological catastrophe, then who placed them there? What civilization possessed the biotechnology to engineer living machines that have operated continuously for millennia? And what is the structure on the seafloor that the Sentinel was guarding? The geometric anomaly that ancient peoples might have known about and chosen to describe in religious texts as the abode of monsters rather than reveal the truth about technology they could not understand or origins they could not explain. The footage exists. The pattern exists. the suppression exists. But the answer to what lies beneath, to what the sentinels were truly designed to protect or monitor or guard, remains hidden in darkness 782 feet down, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to descend and look.